In 1904, two bankers, one Jewish American on Wall Street and one Japanese statesman financier, quietly formed an alliance with a goal that sounded impossible at the time: bring the Russian Empire to its knees. Just 18 months later, Russia was forced to negotiate peace. Japan had entered the ranks of global great powers, and the American banker felt he'd delivered personal justice to a regime he despised. This is not just a war story. This is a finance story about how loans, debt, and credibility can change the course of history. It's about how two men with pens and balance sheets shaped the fate of empires. The war began with shock. There was no formal declaration. On the night of February 8, 1904, Admiral Togo Heihachiro of the Imperial Japanese Navy ordered a surprise torpedo attack on the Russian Pacific Squadron at Port Arthur, Russia's main naval base in southern Manchuria. Several Russian battleships were crippled at anchor, and the rest of the fleet found itself bottled up in the harbor behind coastal guns. Almost immediately, Japan imposed a tight blockade around Port Arthur and gained control of the surrounding waters. That opening move didn't win the war outright, but it set the tone. Japan would strike first, hit hard, and never give Russia time to breathe. Japan understood why speed mattered. Time was on Russia's side, not Japan's. The Tsar ruled a continental empire stretching from Poland to the Pacific, with vast manpower, industry, and natural resources. If Russia was allowed to mobilize slowly and ship reinforcements east, Japan's advantage would vanish. So, Tokyo moved fast. By March 1904, the First Army had already crossed from Japan to the Korean peninsula. The plan was blunt: march north through Korea, push into Russian-held Manchuria, and smash Russian forces in detail before they could fully organize. The first land battles were vicious and close quarters. After days of brutal fighting, Japanese troops forced Russian units to retreat. That victory mattered for more than ground on a map. An Asian nation had just beaten a European empire in modern industrial warfare. Western observers, who still assumed European militaries were inherently superior in discipline, technology, and command, were stunned. But neither Tokyo nor St. Petersburg believed the war was over. Both sides began preparing for a long and extremely costly struggle that would decide who controlled Northeast Asia. Japan dug in and secured its supply lines. Russia tried to pour men, guns, and ammunition into the Far East, but ran headfirst into geography. The empire's only serious lifeline to the theater was the Trans-Siberian Railway. In 1904, that line was still mostly a single track, stretching thousands of miles across brutal terrain. Every rifle, shell, hospital unit, horse, ration crate, artillery piece, and replacement battalion had to crawl along that bottleneck. A snowstorm, derailment, or blown bridge could stall an entire army. Every delay weakened Russia's position and bought Japan time, but everyone in Tokyo understood that window would not stay open forever. Most retellings of the Russo-Japanese War focus on sieges, bayonet charges, and naval duels. Those mattered, but behind the tactics sat something quieter and, in the end, more decisive: money. Modern war is industrial war, and industrial war burns cash. Ammunition, coal for the fleet, steel for guns and armor plate, pay for hundreds of thousands of soldiers and sailors, food, uniforms, field hospitals, transport animals, hospital ships, even spare rails to repair damaged track. All of it had to be purchased constantly. Patriotism doesn't pay shipbuilders. Credit does. Japan needed money as desperately as it needed ammunition. At the heart of Japan's wartime finance stood the Bank of Japan. The bank was only a few decades old, but it had already become the engine of Japan's transformation from a feudal system into an industrial power. On paper, it was a private institution. In practice, it was an arm of state policy. In the 1880s, it secured monopoly control over issuing currency. It printed unified national banknotes and imposed monetary discipline across the country. Just as important, Japan adopted the gold standard. Pegging the yen to gold wasn't cosmetic. It told bankers in London and New York that Japan understood modern finance, honored contracts, and could be trusted to borrow on international markets. That foundation would decide whether Japan could afford to keep fighting. Even so, by 1904, the math was terrifying. Japan's army and navy were performing well on land and sea, but the treasury was under extreme strain. Shells, rifles, armor plate, coal, naval fuel, transport capacity, soldier pay, all demanded hard currency. War costs exploded. Without massive foreign loans, Japan risked going bankrupt before Russia ran out of men. The person asked to prevent that disaster was Takahashi Korekiyo, then a senior executive at the Bank of Japan and one of the most sophisticated financial minds in the country. Takahashi was not a general. He was a strategist of money. He had mastered English, lived in the United States, and held posts in London, India, and China. He had served in the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Education, and even left government to try his hand at a silver mining venture in Peru. That mining project ultimately failed, but it gave him something priceless: contacts and credibility in foreign financial circles. When war with Russia broke out, Takahashi was sent abroad with one mission: secure the money to keep Japan fighting. He went first to the United States, then to Britain, the financial center of the world. He asked for huge loans to finance Japan's war effort. He got rejection after rejection. Western banks still saw Russia as the safer borrower. Russia looked old, gigantic, and rich in land, timber, coal, and oil. Japan, by contrast, looked new, small, and in the eyes of many European financiers, racially inferior and strategically uncertain. Takahashi was close to returning home nearly empty-handed, until he met Jacob Schiff. Jacob Schiff ran Kuhn, Loeb, and Coiters, one of Wall Street's most powerful investment houses. Schiff was respected across American and European finance. But his interest in this war was not purely business. Schiff was Jewish. He had watched Imperial Russia under Tsar Nicholas II and even encouraged violent anti-Jewish pogroms, most notoriously the Kishinev pogrom of 1903, where mobs murdered and terrorized Jewish communities while the authorities looked the other way. Schiff saw Nicholas II not just as a rival power, but as the political face of a system that brutalized his people. For him, helping Japan wasn't only an investment, it was moral revenge. Takahashi explained Japan's reality with absolute honesty. Militarily, Japan was winning early battles. Financially, Japan was near exhaustion. Without immediate access to foreign credit, the war effort would stall and Russia would recover. Schiff listened and agreed to help. That moment quietly changed the balance of the entire conflict. Through Kuhn, Loeb, and Co., Schiff organized massive bond offerings for the Japanese government. He personally bought Japanese bonds and then persuaded major American banks, including First National Bank and National City Bank, to participate. By the end of 1904, Japan had raised roughly $200 million in foreign loans. For the time, this was an astonishing figure, equivalent to many billions in today's money, and it covered nearly half of Japan's total war budget. Just as important, it was the first time Wall Street had financed Japan on that scale. Schiff's credibility opened doors that Takahashi alone could not. Schiff didn't just raise money and walk away. He urged Takahashi to tell Tokyo to push harder, not softer. He wanted Japan to win outright, not settle for a compromise. He openly hoped that a decisive Japanese victory would cripple Nicholas VI's regime, maybe even bring it down. With new capital behind it, Japan escalated immediately. In May 1904, Japan's Second Army landed on the Liaodong Peninsula, the narrow finger of land that leads down toward Port Arthur. Russian forces had fortified the ridgelines, but they were outnumbered and steadily pushed back. Japanese troops seized key heights and rail links and cut Port Arthur off from the rest of the Russian army in Manchuria. At the same time, more Japanese divisions landed on Korea's eastern coast and formed the Third Army, whose mission was simple: capture Port Arthur. A Fourth Army pushed along the Manchurian coast to close the trap. By late May, Port Arthur was encircled. While Japanese troops tightened the ring, Russia's crisis deepened. Even before the war, the imperial budget was cracking. By 1902, the so-called balanced budget was already fiction. Peasants were heavily taxed and angry, industrial workers were restless, and the treasury was desperate. War spending made everything worse. The Tsar's advisors had two bad choices: print money and risk inflation and panic, or borrow abroad at brutal interest rates that would publicly advertise Russia's weakness to the same foreign bankers it needed. Neither choice solved the underlying problem. Russia was bleeding money and losing ground. The siege of Port Arthur dragged into late 1904 and early 1905. Japanese heavy guns pounded the Russian forts day after day. Casualties were horrific on both sides. Finally, Port Arthur surrendered. The fall of the fortress stunned St. Petersburg and thrilled Tokyo. But the war was not finished. Reinforcements from European Russia finally reached Manchuria by rail, and the Tsar's generals prepared a massive counteroffensive. That counteroffensive climaxed at Mukden. There, in one of the largest land battles the world had seen up to that point, 3 Russian armies, about 330,000 men with more than 1,500 guns, faced 3 Japanese armies totaling roughly 270,000 men with just over 1,000 guns. On paper, Russia had more men and more artillery. In practice, Japan had momentum, coordination, and a willingness to absorb terrifying losses if that's what victory required. After weeks of maneuver and attrition, Russian lines broke. Mukden fell to Japan. Almost at the same time, Japan won at sea. The Imperial Japanese Navy destroyed most of Russia's Baltic fleet, which had sailed halfway around the world from Europe in a desperate attempt to break Japanese control of Far Eastern waters. That decisive engagement, remembered as the destruction of the Baltic fleet at Tsushima, shattered Russia's naval hopes. Between Mukden on land and Tsushima at sea, Russia had been beaten in both theaters almost back to back. The psychological impact inside the empire was enormous. Inside Russia, anger erupted. News of defeat collided with long-building rage over poverty, censorship, police brutality, and ethnic repression. Strikes, protests, and mutinies broke out across major cities, and even in parts of the army and navy. The myth of Tsarist invincibility collapsed. For the first time, Nicholas II faced not just foreign pressure, but serious internal instability. Japan now held the cards. It had battlefield victories, national morale, and, thanks to Takahashi and Schiff, the money to keep going if it had to. Russia had staggering losses and spreading unrest. Both governments agreed to negotiate. Talks took place in the United States. President Theodore Roosevelt acted as mediator, seeing a chance to stabilize East Asia, raise American prestige, and keep the conflict from escalating into a broader imperial war. He would later receive the Nobel Peace Prize for his role. The Treaty of Portsmouth, signed in September 1905, made Japan the clear winner. Japan gained control of the Liaodong Peninsula, including Port Arthur, a first-rate naval base. It took over the South Manchurian Railway, a strategic and commercial asset that linked Manchurian resources to broader Asian markets. It received the southern half of Sakhalin Island. Russia agreed to withdraw from southern Manchuria, which would later be restored to Chinese control. Most importantly, Japan's dominance in Korea was now openly acknowledged. The world was stunned. For centuries, European empires had assumed automatic military and technological superiority over Asia. Now, an Asian country had defeated a European empire in a modern industrial war. That single fact forced London, Paris, Berlin, and Washington to take Japan seriously as a great power, not as a junior outsider. Jacob Schiff's role became global news. Newspapers described the American banker who had financed Japan's war effort. Schiff was invited to Japan as an honored guest, personally received by the emperor, an almost unheard-of honor for a foreigner. He became the first non-Japanese person ever awarded the Order of the Rising Sun. For Schiff, this was more than ceremony. It was vindication. He had used finance to hurt a regime that had brutalized Jewish communities. Inside Russia, the consequences were explosive. Defeat abroad lit the fuse of the revolution of 1905. Workers formed councils. Sailors mutinied. Crowds filled the streets. Shots were fired. Nicholas II tried to save his throne with a mix of concessions and repression. Limited constitutional reforms and a new parliament on one hand, brutal crackdowns on the other. Thousands died. The monarchy survived, but it was permanently weakened. The cracks in the Romanov system were now visible to everyone. Those cracks widened over the next decade. In 1914, Russia plunged into World War I, another massive industrial conflict it was not prepared to finance or supply. Catastrophic battlefield losses, shortages, hunger, and fury at the ruling elite pushed the system past its breaking point. In February 1917, Nicholas II abdicated. The Romanov dynasty collapsed. By October 1917, the Bolsheviks seized power and Russia fell into civil war. The Tsar and his family were executed soon after. Jacob Schiff's name resurfaced during this chaos. Many contemporaries claimed he had secretly backed anti-Tsarist movements and even provided money to revolutionary factions to help break the monarchy. The story made emotional sense. A Jewish American banker, enraged by pogroms, helping to destroy an anti-Semitic regime. Historians still debate how much direct funding he actually provided, and to whom, but even the rumor shows what this war revealed, that finance itself had become a geopolitical weapon. Takahashi Korekiyo's path after the Russo-Japanese War was equally consequential. He became the 7th governor of the Bank of Japan and later served 6 separate times as Japan's Minister of Finance. In 1921, he briefly served as prime minister. During the global crisis of the 1930s, he pushed aggressive public spending and easy monetary policy to fight recession and unemployment. Economists often call him Keynes before Keynes, because his use of deficit spending and monetary easing anticipated ideas that later became mainstream. But his story ends in violence. By the mid-1930s, Japan's hardline military factions demanded ever larger defense budgets and rapid expansion on the Asian mainland. Takahashi warned that unlimited military spendings would wreck the yen, trigger inflation, and push Japan toward financial collapse. That warning made him a target. In February 1936, young army officers staged a coup attempt. They assassinated Takahashi in his home. His murder marked the end of moderate civilian economic control and the beginning of Japan's slide into open militarism. Step back, and the pattern is clear. Neither Takahashi Korekiyo nor Jacob Schiff ever led troops in battle. They never commanded fleets or stormed trenches, yet their decisions moved armies, funded navies, wrecked the prestige of an empire, and redrew the balance of power in East Asia. Takahashi wasn't wearing a uniform, but he understood that without liquidity, even the best-trained army becomes a static target. He forced Japan to behave like a disciplined creditor nation instead of an improvising regional power. He treated war finance like engineering. Stabilize the currency so foreign lenders trust you, secure external borrowing in hard money, and then feed that money directly into force projection before the opponent can recover. He knew Japan could not match Russia man for man in a prolonged land campaign. So he designed a timeline financed by debt, hit fast, hit decisively, and pay for that speed with borrowed capital rather than domestic reserves. Schiff, on the other hand, understood leverage from the opposite angle. He recognized that the Russian Empire looked huge on a map, but structurally fragile, overloaded with debt already, bleeding cash on rail expansion, politically isolated, internally unstable, and hated by minority populations, the state suppressed but depended on for labor and taxation. By injecting credit into Japan and simultaneously starving Russia of favorable terms in Western markets, he didn't just bankroll one side, he weakened the other side's access to rescue financing. Schiff basically turned bond underwriting into asymmetric warfare. He priced risk in a way that punished the Tsar. He signaled to New York, London, and Paris that lending to Russia meant attaching your capital to a repressive, unstable, increasingly combustible regime. That kind of reputational framing raises borrowing costs, and higher borrowing costs reduce strategic freedom. So even though no cannon had fired on St. Petersburg yet, Russian power was already eroding on ledger paper. Takahashi and Schiff, operating independently but aligned in outcome, proved that war leadership can sit in a bank office, not a bunker. Takahashi saw national credit as a weapon to buy time for battlefield maneuver. Schiff saw denial of credit as a weapon to accelerate institutional collapse. One built a temporary bridge of money so Japan could act like a first-rate imperial power before it technically was one. The other quietly drilled holes in the foundation of a European empire that still believed it was untouchable. Together, they showed that artillery destroys regiments, but financing destroys legitimacy. And once legitimacy cracks, empires don't just lose territory, they start to lose the right to rule. The Russo-Japanese War is usually remembered for the siege of Port Arthur, the Battle of Mukden, and the destruction of the Russian Baltic Fleet at Tsushima, but its quieter lesson is this. empires can rise or fall because someone agrees to underwrite a bond issue. Japan's leap into great power status, the shock to European confidence, and the chain of crises that helped to doom Nicholas II all trace back to a single working relationship formed in 1904 between two bankers most ordinary people had never heard of. That relationship didn't only finance shells and coal, it rearranged strategic geography. The cash that Schiff helped unlock let Japan seize Korea as a protectorate, embed itself in southern Manchuria, secure Port Arthur, and take control of the South Manchurian Railway, which was more than track and stations. It was an artery for resource extraction, troop movement, and political influence deep inside the Asian mainland. That railway became leverage. Whoever controlled it could dictate who moved grain, ore, timber, and soldiers across Manchuria, and by dictating movement, they dictated reality on the ground, without needing to annex everything outright on day one. At the same time, Russia's defeat didn't just bruise imperial pride. It detonated domestic faith in the Romanov system. The humiliation of losing to a non-European power shattered the image of inevitability around the Tsar. That shock fed the 1905 revolution, forced concessions that weakened autocratic control, trained networks of agitators who would later drive strikes, mutinies, and uprisings, and ultimately help set the stage for the collapse of the dynasty in 1917. In other words, the war did not end when the Treaty of Portsmouth was signed. The financial architecture behind that war kept reshaping events for more than a decade. Japan converted wartime debt into imperial position. Russia converted wartime debt into regime crisis. And at the center of that divergence is the fact that one side had a credible external sponsor who believed in its cause and pushed capital into it at scale, while the other side was forced to finance decline at gunpoint. That is why this conflict matters beyond the battlefield history. It is the blueprint for modern power politics. Align financial markets with your strategic objectives, frame your enemy as an unstable credit risk, and then let the pressure of servicing debt do part of the work that used to require armies.